She entered the palace as a poor interpreter, but one portrait revealed she had been standing inside her own buried history. Darius.
And when the palace expected him to choose power, the Duke chose the woman everyone had underestimated. I wanted if you'll let me.
That was high-handed.
Yes.
She had 3 seconds before the most powerful man in Europe destroyed her reputation in a language he believed she didn't speak. The Grand Duke of Cain leaned toward his son in the gilded reception hall of Beaumont Palace, his voice a velvet sneer in flawless German. Sei ist arm und unbedeutend. Warum stehst du sie an? She is poor and insignificant. Why do you stare at her? And every titled guest within earshot suppressed a smile. Every diplomat turned politely away, and Charlotte Darius, standing 10 feet distant in a borrowed gown with her chin lifted and her pulse steady as stone, heard every single word. Welcome to the Royal Duke Diaries, where the most dangerous thing in any palace is a woman who understands exactly what was said about her. It had started, as most life-altering things do, with a letter she almost didn't open. Charlotte had been sitting in her apartment in Brussels, a 4th-floor walk-up with cracked tile and a window that caught exactly 40 minutes of afternoon sun. When the cream-colored envelope arrived bearing a royal crest, she recognized immediately. The Beaumont Summit, the European Royal Alliance's annual convening of crowns, heads of state, and the families attached to them by blood or ambition. She'd applied for the position of lead interpreter 6 months ago on something that felt embarrassingly close to impulse. Her German was flawless. Her French was better than most native speakers. Her formal English carried the kind of precision that institutions paid handsomely for. And her references, 3 ambassadors, a retired chancellor, and one quietly legendary linguistics professor named Dr. Darius, were impeccable. She had not expected them to call her. She had certainly not expected to be assigned to the inner circle, the private translation relay for the most sensitive diplomatic conversations of the 3-day summit, the kind of position typically reserved for interpreters with a decade of palace experience and a family name that opened doors. Charlotte had neither. What she had was a mother who'd died when she was 12, a father who'd built a quiet life from books and language, and a ferocious, bone-deep commitment to being so undeniably excellent that no one could justify turning her away. She'd learned German as a child, not from textbooks, but from her mother's voice, low and precise, reading Rilke aloud at bedtime. She'd never fully understood why her mother's German carried that particular accent, that almost aristocratic cadence that didn't match the simple schoolteacher life they led. She'd stopped asking questions about it when her mother stopped being alive to answer them. She accepted the position, packed one good dress, altered it herself to fit properly, and boarded a train to Vienna. The Beaumont Palace was older than most nations, and more beautiful than anything Charlotte had ever stood inside. Its halls were 30 feet high, its chandeliers the size of small houses, its floors a mosaic of marble that reflected candlelight like the surface of a winter lake. She walked through the staff entrance with her credentials and her composure, and she told herself it didn't matter that everyone else in the building had arrived through the front. She was professional. She was prepared. She was invisible in the way that skilled interpreters learn to be, present without being intrusive, useful without being noticed. That was before the Duke of Cain noticed her. She felt him before she saw him. It was during the preliminary reception, the first evening, champagne and introductions and the careful theater of powerful people pretending to be relaxed. Charlotte stood near the east corridor, her earpiece in, her notepad ready, monitoring a conversation between 2 foreign ministers about agricultural policy, translating softly for the British liaison at her side. The air in the room shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing she could have described to anyone afterward without sounding foolish. But something changed. A drop in temperature, a tightening in the atmosphere, the way a room full of people rearranges itself unconsciously around a new center of gravity. She looked up. Duke Malric Cain had arrived. He was tall, not merely tall but commanding in a way that made height feel irrelevant, as though the real measurement was something else entirely. Dark hair, sharp jaw, shoulders that filled his formal jacket without effort. He moved through the reception with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his life needed to push to reach the front of a room. People simply made way. Ministers straightened. Women recalibrated their smiles. His father, the Grand Duke Aldrich Cain, older, heavier, with the kind of face that wore cruelty the way other men wore cologne, walked half a step behind him, which told Charlotte something immediately. Even between those two, the power was Malric's. She returned her attention to the ministers, but not before his gaze, sweeping the room with the practiced disinterest of a man who rarely found anything worth lingering on, landed on her and stopped. Just for a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then it moved on, and Charlotte pressed her earpiece and focused, and told herself that powerful men looked at everything. It meant nothing. It was reflex. She believed that for approximately 40 minutes. He found a reason to be on her side of the room within the hour. She was translating for a Swedish delegate when she became aware of him, not looking at her, not approaching, simply standing nearby with a glass of mineral water and an expression of mild interest in the conversation happening 10 feet to his left. He was too close for coincidence, and too practiced in his positioning to be accidental about it. Charlotte finished her translation and subtly shifted her angle. He shifted his, almost imperceptibly. She moved again. So did he. She stopped moving and waited, and after a moment, to her profound irritation, felt the corner of her own mouth trying to rise. "You're very good at that," he said, not looking at her. "At what, Your Grace?" She kept her voice neutral, professional. She'd been briefed on all attendees. She knew exactly who he was. Making yourself heard without drawing attention. Now he did look at her. Up close, his eyes were a shade she hadn't anticipated. Not brown, not quite gray, but something in between that felt uncomfortably direct. Most interpreters develop this quality over years. You seem to have arrived with it already. I've been told I'm a quick study. Who told you that? Everyone I've ever proven right. A beat of silence. His expression didn't change. Not exactly. But something behind his eyes shifted and settled, like a door that had been slightly open, easing all the way. "Malric Kane," he said, as though she might not know. "Charlotte Darius." She didn't curtsy. She was staff, not a visiting noble. The correct protocol was a brief nod, which she gave. "Lead interpreter for the summit. If you need translation services during your scheduled sessions, my team is—" "I speak 6 languages," he said. "Then you won't need us much." "No," he agreed. "I suppose I won't." He held her gaze for 1 second too long, and then his father appeared at his elbow, and the warmth in the air between them vanished, like smoke. Grand Duke Aldrich Kane was the kind of man who had never needed to raise his voice because the threat was always present underneath, coiled and patient. He looked at Charlotte the way certain men looked at things they considered beneath consideration. Not with contempt exactly, but with that particular blankness that said you don't register as worthy of a real reaction. He said something to his son in German. Casual, murmured. Designed to be private. "Sie sieht aus wie eine Sekretärin. Was redest du mit ihr?" "She looks like a secretary. What are you talking to her about?" Charlotte did not react. She had trained herself over years of professional work to receive information without displaying it. Her face stayed composed, attentive, pleasant. Malric's expression tightened slightly. "Father," but Aldrich wasn't finished. He tilted his head, still in German, his voice just slightly louder now. Not loud enough to carry across the room, but loud enough that the 2 men standing nearest them could hear. A count whose name Charlotte hadn't caught, and a young lord with a smirk that suggested he already knew what was coming. "Sie ist arm und unbedeutend. Warum starrst du sie an? Solche Frauen sind nicht für Männer wie uns." "She is poor and insignificant. Why do you stare at her? Women like that are not for men like us." The smirk widened on the young lord's face. Charlotte counted to 2. Then she turned, directly and without hurry, and looked at the Grand Duke with an expression of polite attention, and replied, in German so precise and so formal that it carried the particular cadence of old aristocratic courts. "The German of chancelleries and royal houses, not textbooks," she said. "Ich bitte um Vergebung, Euer Gnaden. Ich wollte nicht stören. Ich wollte nur erwähnen, dass der Hauptmikrofon in Ihrem privaten Sitzungssaal morgen früh kalibriert wird. Und falls Sie wünschen, dass Ihre Aussagen vertraulich bleiben, empfehle ich Ihnen, dies auch außerhalb davon zu beachten." "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." "I did not mean to intrude. I only wish to mention that the primary microphone in your private session hall will be calibrated tomorrow morning. And if you wish your remarks to remain confidential, I would suggest keeping that in mind outside of it as well." Then she added, still in perfect German, with the quietest possible smile. "Und für das Protokoll arm ist ein relativer Begriff. Unbedeutend ist eine Frage der Perspektive. And for the record, poor is a relative term. Insignificant is a matter of perspective." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. The young lord with the smirk had stopped smirking. The Count made a sound that was almost certainly a suppressed laugh and converted it with impressive speed into a cough. Grand Duke Aldrich's face had gone a shade that didn't exist in nature, and Malric Kane, Duke of Kane, feared and respected across 4 nations, a man whose composure was reportedly legendary, looked at Charlotte Darius with an expression she had no diplomatic category for. It was not amusement, though there was something warm in it. It was not admiration, though there was something sharp and certain. It was the look of a man who had just realized something he hadn't been prepared for, something that had shifted the floor under him in a way he hadn't felt in a very long time. Charlotte gave both men a perfectly correct professional nod, turned, and walked back toward the east corridor. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached it, but she held them steady until she rounded the corner, and then she pressed them flat against the stone wall and breathed. She had just spoken like that to a Grand Duke at a royal summit. She had either ended her career in 20 seconds or changed everything. Possibly both. She did not sleep well that night. The staff quarters were comfortable enough. A single room with a proper bed and a window overlooking the garden. But her mind refused to settle. She replayed the exchange in the reception hall with the particular cruelty of an anxious brain that keeps returning to its most dangerous memory. She'd been professional. She hadn't been rude, not technically. She had couched everything in politeness and diplomatic language. She had not said, "You are a cruel small man dressed in old money." She had said, "Please be mindful of the microphones." And then she had said the other thing, which was, fine. Perhaps that had been slightly less professional. Poor is a relative term. Insignificant is a matter of perspective. She pressed her face into the pillow and made a noise that was not quite a groan. In the morning, she was called to the summit coordinator's office. She dressed carefully and went. The coordinator, a severe woman named Madame Fontaine, who had been organizing royal events since before Charlotte was born, studied her across a desk covered in color-coded schedules. "I understand there was a notable exchange last evening at the reception." "Yes," Charlotte said. "I hope I handled the situation with appropriate discretion." Madame Fontaine looked at her for a long moment. "The Grand Duke has requested your removal from the Inner Circle translation team." Charlotte's chest tightened. There it was. "However," the coordinator continued, "the Duke of Kane has countered that request with one of his own. His Grace has specifically requested that you remain assigned to his private sessions for the duration of the summit." Madame Fontaine folded her hands. "The Duke's private sessions carry the highest diplomatic priority of the event. His request supersedes his father's. That contains several things at once. You will continue in your position, Miss Darius. I suggest you continue to be excellent at it." Charlotte walked out of that office with her heartbeat doing something complicated and unprofessional. The first private session was that afternoon, a small conference room, by palace standards, which meant it was still enormous, with a long mahogany table and tall windows overlooking the formal garden. Malric arrived precisely on time, which she was learning was characteristic of him. 3 aides accompanied him in. 2 left immediately. The one who remained introduced himself as Mr. Harlan, the Duke's chief of staff, and then moved to stand near the door in the particular way that skilled assistants had of becoming part of the furniture. Malric sat across the table from where she'd placed herself, not at the head, at the middle, close enough that the conversation would feel direct. "Miss Darius," he said, "Your Grace." She opened her notepad. "I understand the session today covers preliminary alliance provisions for the Baltic trade routes. If you need me to relay, I need to apologize to you." She stopped. He had his hands clasped on the table, his posture upright and entirely undefensive, which was its own kind of power, the ability to apologize without making it look like weakness. "My father's remarks were inappropriate. I should have stopped him before you were subjected to them. You have nothing to apologize for, Your Grace. His remarks were his own. His remarks were made in my presence and on my behalf, even if I didn't request them." Something moved across his face. He was commenting on something I had been doing, which was noticing you. "The fault for the entire situation begins with me." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "He wasn't wrong about the poor part," she said finally. "Objectively speaking, my apartment in Brussels has a broken radiator, and I've been meaning to call the landlord for 3 months. Malric stared at her. "As for insignificant," she added, "I suppose that depends on how you define the word." And then, slowly, like something that had been held back by years of training and duty, and the specific gravity of being a duke, he smiled. Not the polished public event version she'd seen in the reception hall. Something real. Something that made the lines of his face rearrange into something entirely different, warmer, younger, almost unsettling in how genuine it was. "I think your definition and mine would agree," he said quietly. Charlotte looked down at her notepad and told herself to be professional. She was professional. It was simply very, very difficult. The Baltic trade session ran 2 hours. Charlotte relayed, translated, clarified, and remained in the background with perfect efficiency. But she was aware, with an acuity that she usually reserved for language and tone, of the way Malric handled the room. He was patient with the delegates who needed repetition. He was quietly firm with the ones who tried to reframe agreed terms. He asked questions that sounded simple and cut through to the exact problem in 3 words. He listened, genuinely listened, not the performance of listening that powerful people often employed, and he made people feel that what they'd said had mattered. By the end of the session, she had formed an opinion of him that was considerably more complicated than the one she'd walked in with. As the delegates filed out, he remained seated. She began gathering her notes. "You're German," he said. "Where did you learn it?" She paused. "My mother. She was German." She was a beat, something careful in her chest. She spoke German. She learned it young. She had a particular accent. "What kind of accent?" Charlotte looked up. "Why does it matter?" He held her gaze steadily. "Because your German doesn't sound like a learned language. It sounds like a first one. And the register you used last night in the reception hall. The formal register, that's not something you pick up from a parent who simply learned German young." He tilted his head slightly. "That's the dialect of old houses, old families. The silence between them was different from the silences that had come before it. Sharper, more aware of itself. My mother died when I was 12, Charlotte said. She left behind a lot of things I didn't fully understand. Her German was one of them." She picked up her notepad and folder. "Will there be anything else before tomorrow's session, Your Grace?" He didn't push. She noted that too, noted it with something that felt dangerously close to gratitude. "No," he said. "Thank you, Miss Darius." She walked out and stood in the corridor for a moment with her back against the wall, thinking about her mother's accent and the way Malric Kane had identified it with the precision of someone who knew exactly what old German houses sounded like, and wondering, not for the first time, what her mother had never told her. The second day of the summit brought complications. The first was Victor Lennox. Lord Victor Lennox was 32, blonde, charming in the particular way of men who'd been told since boyhood that they were charming, and attached to the British diplomatic mission in a capacity that seemed to involve attending parties more than attending meetings. He found Charlotte during the mid-morning break outside the garden terrace, where she was reviewing the afternoon's translation materials, and sat down beside her without asking. "You're the interpreter who said the thing to old Kane last night," he said cheerfully. "I provided a professional reminder about microphone protocols," Charlotte replied without looking up, in absolutely perfect formal German that apparently made him look like a fool in front of a count and his own son. Victor stretched his legs out comfortably. "It's all anyone in the British delegation is talking about. You're something of a legend this morning. I'd prefer to be something of an interpreter. Would you have dinner with me tonight?" Now she looked up. He was watching her with the particular attentiveness of a man who'd rarely been told no and was treating her as an interesting experiment. She could recognize it, that particular cocktail of genuine curiosity and the comfortable assumption of eventual success. "I have evening duties," she said pleasantly. "Tomorrow night, then. I'll be on call. The night after Lord Lennox." She kept her voice kind. "I appreciate the invitation. I'm working. When I'm working, I'm only thinking about work. There isn't space for anything else." He smiled, undeterred. "I'm patient. I believe you." She returned to her notes. "That doesn't change my schedule." He left. She breathed out. She didn't notice, from the window above the garden terrace, the figure who had been standing there for some portion of that conversation, watching with an expression that was very still and very intent. She noticed it later, not from the window. She hadn't looked up, but from Malric himself that afternoon, when his chief of staff, Mr. Harlan, quietly mentioned, before the session, that the afternoon agenda had been slightly restructured and Lord Lennox's delegation would not be participating in the Duke's private briefings. "Was Lord Lennox scheduled to participate?" she asked Harlan, slightly confused, since she'd seen no such listing on her materials. Harlan gave her a look that was professionally neutral in a way that communicated considerable information. There was some initial discussion of it. His Grace felt it wasn't appropriate given the sensitivity of the trade provisions. "I see," said Charlotte. She filed that away and said nothing. During the session itself, Malric was focused and efficient as he'd been the day before. But at one point, she was relaying a complicated clause about Baltic shipping rights. She felt his gaze settle on her face with a weight that had nothing to do with the translation and everything to do with something she didn't have a diplomatic category for. When the session ended and the room cleared, he said, without preamble, "Lennox spoke to you this morning. It wasn't a question." Charlotte looked at him steadily. "Lord Lennox was polite. We spoke briefly. He asked you to dinner." She raised an eyebrow. "With respect, Your Grace, that isn't relevant to the summit agenda." Something crossed his face. Controlled, but not fully controlled. His jaw set. He looked at the table for a moment and then back at her with an expression that was almost frustration, which on the face of a man who appeared to feel very few things outwardly was remarkable. "No," he said, "it isn't." He gathered his papers and left. Charlotte stood in the empty room for a moment. Well, she thought, that evening the summit held a formal dinner. Charlotte was on call but not required at the table. She monitored from the translation station near the east corridor, earpiece in, watching the room through the glass partition that separated the working staff from the grand hall. The dinner was extraordinary. 140 guests, 3 tables of crystal and gold, the kind of event that existed to remind everyone present of exactly how stratified the world was. She watched Grand Duke Aldrich at the main table. He was laughing at something, expansive and comfortable, a man in his element, not a trace on his face of last night's exchange. Men like him, she'd learned, didn't carry humiliations the way other people did. They converted them into irritants and moved on. What they rarely did was forget. She was watching Aldrich when his gaze found her through the glass. He couldn't see her clearly. The partition was partially mirrored. He shouldn't have been able to find her at all. But he looked directly at her for 3 full seconds, with an expression that made the fine hair on her arms rise, and then turned back to his conversation. She told herself it was coincidence. She didn't quite believe it. Malric was at the opposite end of the main table, beside a duchess whose name Charlotte had in her briefing files, Duchess Margot Lorraine, young, beautiful, connected to 3 European royal families, and, according to the diplomatic gossip that filtered through staff briefings, widely expected to be the match the Kane family had in mind for Malric. She was poised and perfect, and exactly what the word appropriate looked like when it was wearing pearls. Malric spoke to her politely, ate beside her properly, laughed twice at what appeared to be something clever she'd said, and at no point did he look toward the translation station. At no point did Charlotte expect him to. At no point, she told herself, did it matter. She looked at her notepad. She reviewed tomorrow's materials. She was professional. She was thoroughly, impeccably, exhaustingly professional. It was after midnight when the dinner concluded, and the staff were released in shifts. Charlotte changed out of the formal summit attire that her role required and pulled on her own coat. A good one, well made, bought 3 years ago during a rare flush period, and took the long way through the palace back to the staff quarters because the long way went through the portrait gallery, and she'd wanted to see it since she arrived, and the summit would be over in 36 hours. The gallery was empty at this hour, long and pale, with high ceilings and windows that let in the winter moon, the walls lined with centuries of faces that stared down with the particular self-possession of people who'd never had to apologize for existing. She walked slowly, reading the small brass plaques beneath each portrait. Kings and queens and dukes and viscounts, the long chain of blood and title that defined this world. She stopped at a painting near the end of the west wall, not because of the subject, a woman in early 19th century dress, dark-haired, formal, unremarkable by the standards of royal portraiture, but because of something about the line of her jaw, the angle of her eyes, the way her hands were folded at the base of her portrait in a gesture that Charlotte recognized with a physical jolt that moved through her chest like a current. Her mother had folded her hands exactly like that. She stepped closer, read the plaque, Countess Margarethe Darius Schönberg, 1798-1854, the House of Schönberg, Bavaria. Darius. Her mother's name had been Darius. Her father's name was Darius. She had always assumed that was her father's name, that her mother had taken it when they married. But her father had been English, and she'd never known his family, and now she was standing in a royal palace gallery at midnight, looking at the jaw of a 19th century Bavarian countess, and feeling the floor shift. "The Schönberg line," said a voice behind her. She turned. Malric stood at the entrance to the gallery. He'd removed his formal jacket and wore his white shirt with his cravat loosened, the closest to informal she'd seen him, and he was looking not at her, but at the portrait. "You know this family?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She didn't know how. "I know all the old families." He walked toward her slowly. The Schönberg title was dissolved in the 1880s. The last countess left Bavaria under difficult circumstances. There was a scandal, a marriage considered unsuitable by the family, a child, a disappearance. He stopped beside her, looking at the portrait. "The story is that she went to England with an Englishman and was never publicly acknowledged by her family again." Charlotte was very still. "She had a daughter," Malric said. "The daughter was never legitimized by the family's acknowledgement, but the blood was real. The old families in Bavaria know this." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were quiet and serious and very direct. "Your accent, Miss Darius, your register, the formal German of old houses." Another pause. "You have her jaw." The gallery was very quiet. "My mother's name was Anna Darius," Charlotte said. "She was a teacher." "Yes," said Malric. "She was. Before that, she was the granddaughter of Margaret Darius Schönberg." He watched her face carefully. "I don't believe you knew this." "I didn't." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. She cleared her throat. I don't know what to do with this." "Nothing," he said. "Not tonight. Tonight you found a portrait in a gallery. That's all." She looked at him. "Why are you here, at midnight, in the portrait gallery?" Something passed over his face, something honest that he didn't bother to hide. "Because I watched you walk this way from the dinner corridor," he said, "and I told myself it was a security concern. That staff shouldn't be alone in the palace at night." He paused. "I was lying to myself." Charlotte held his gaze. The winter moonlight came through the high windows and fell between them, pale and very still. "You should go back to your quarters, Your Grace," she said softly. "I know." Neither of them moved for another 10 seconds. Then he inclined his head, formal, precise, a duke's acknowledgement, and turned and walked back the way he'd come. She watched him go, then turned back to the portrait of Countess Margaret and stood there for a long time in the dark. Her mother's folded hands, her mother's jaw, her mother's German that sounded like first homes and old houses and things that had never been explained. "Poor is a relative term," she had said. She hadn't known then how relative. The third and final day of the summit began before dawn. Charlotte was at her station by 6. Her eyes were clear. She'd slept 4 hours and told herself that was sufficient. Her notes were organized. Her earpiece was calibrated. She had a job to do, and she was going to do it with the same impeccable precision she'd brought to everything else, regardless of midnight galleries and century-old portraits and a duke who watched her walk and then told her the truth about it. The morning passed in a controlled blur of final sessions and provision signings. At 10, she was called to relay during a difficult negotiation between the Norwegian and Austrian delegations about fishing rights that had somehow become a proxy argument about something else entirely, and she spent 40 minutes threading her translations with such careful diplomatic nuance that the session coordinator looked at her afterward with the expression of someone who'd witnessed something rare. "You kept that from collapsing," the coordinator said. "I relayed accurately," Charlotte said. "I didn't do anything. You translated a declaration of this as non-negotiable, as this position warrants deep consideration, and an ultimatum as a sincere recommendation, and you did it in 3 languages simultaneously without missing a beat." The coordinator shook her head slightly. "You're extraordinary, Miss Darius." Charlotte thanked her and went to find coffee. She found trouble instead. It was in the corridor outside the main session hall. Grand Duke Aldrich was standing with 2 men she didn't recognize. Not delegates. Not staff, something else. The kind of men who existed in the background of powerful families doing things that weren't put in briefing documents. He saw her coming and made no move to step aside. She made to pass him, inclining her head in professional acknowledgement. "Miss Darius," he said, in German. She stopped. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. "My son tells me you have been invaluable to the summit proceedings." "I've tried to serve the summit well," she replied in English. A choice that was itself a statement. He noted it. "I understand you had an interesting evening. The portrait gallery." He watched her face. "My family has been connected to the Beaumont Palace archives for generations. The staff reports to my office on matters of security." Her skin went cold. "Staff walking through the gallery after midnight is a security matter," she said evenly. Staff meeting privately with my son in areas of the palace not covered by official summit business, he said softly. Still in that calm, pleasant tone, is a matter I take very seriously. He tilted his head. Whatever you believe you discovered last night, Miss Darius, about old families, dissolved titles, histories that were buried for reasons, I would encourage you to leave it buried. The smile didn't waver. You are an extraordinarily skilled interpreter. I would hate for your career to be affected by associations that are, how shall I say this, above your station. Charlotte looked at him. She thought about what he'd just confirmed, that he'd known. He'd known about her bloodline, about the Schönberg connection, and that was why last night's language hadn't been cruelty, born of ignorance. It had been deliberate. Calculated intimidation by a man who'd looked at her and recognized something, and immediately tried to make her feel small enough to disappear. She thought about her mother, reading Rilke in a voice that came from old houses. She thought about Malric, standing in moonlight, telling her the truth when he didn't have to. She said, in German, very quietly, Ich werde nichts begraben, was mir gehört. I will not bury what belongs to me. And she walked past him. She was halfway to the translation station when she heard her name. Charlotte, not Miss Darius, not the interpreter. Her name, spoken with a directness that cut through the ambient noise of the corridor like a key in a lock. She turned. Malric was coming from the direction of his father, and his expression told her he'd heard at least some of what had just passed. His face was controlled but not cold, controlled in the way that contained heat rather than absence. Are you all right? He asked. I'm fine. What did he say to you? Nothing I couldn't handle. His jaw worked for a moment. Charlotte, Your Grace. She kept her voice quiet and firm. I have a session in 20 minutes. I need to be at my station. We can... She paused, and something honest slipped through her professional armor. Because she was tired and the morning had been strange and last night had been stranger, and she was carrying the weight of an entire lineage she hadn't known belonged to her. We can talk later, if you want. I need to work right now. He looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded, once. The same nod she'd seen him use with diplomats, not deference, but acknowledgement. I hear you. I'll wait. She went to her station. For the first time in 3 days, her hands shook slightly as she put in her earpiece. She made them stop. She was professional. She was always professional. Even when everything else was fracturing around her, she was this, precise and steady and present. It was the thing she'd built herself from, and she was not going to let one man's deliberate cruelty and another man's unprecedented gentleness take it from her in the same morning. The session began. She translated. She was extraordinary at it. The final signing ceremony was held at 3 p.m. in the grand ballroom. All summit participants attended, delegates, heads of family, diplomatic staff stationed at the edges and behind the columns in their professional invisibility. Charlotte stood near the east column, earpiece in, notepad ready, watching the room with the particular attention that had become second nature over 3 days. The provisions were signed in sequence. Languages were read aloud by each delegation's representative. Charlotte's voice in the earpiece of the British delegate, steady and precise, carrying each clause across the language gap with the kind of care that made complex things sound simple without losing their weight. It went perfectly. Afterward, champagne was served, and the summit dissolved from formal proceedings into something softer, conversations, photographs, the gradual relaxation of people who'd been performing for 3 days and could now put the performance down for an hour. Charlotte was documenting her final notes when Victor Lennox appeared again, champagne in hand, smile fully operational. Last chance, he said. I leave for London tomorrow morning. She looked up from her notes. Lord Lennox, one dinner, he said. One conversation. You are the most interesting person at this entire summit, and I've spent 3 days trying to tell you that. He wasn't performing now. The charm was still there, but something genuine had surfaced underneath it. I know you're busy. I know you don't care about my title. I just think you should know that someone noticed. She opened her mouth. She's otherwise occupied this evening. The voice came from directly behind Victor Lennox, and it was calm and absolutely final in a way that made the room feel slightly smaller. Victor turned around. Malric Kane looked at him with an expression that was entirely polite and entirely immovable, the way a mountain was polite. It didn't attack. It simply couldn't be moved. Your Grace, Victor said, recovering smoothly. I know what you were doing, Malric said pleasantly. She's otherwise occupied. Charlotte looked between them. With respect, Your Grace, I'm quite capable of managing my own... I know you are, Malric said, And he looked at her then, and the look was different from anything she'd seen on his face in 3 days of watching him. Not controlled, not careful, not the calibrated expression of a man who'd learned to keep himself behind glass. It was direct and unguarded and almost urgent. "But I'd like to be the one who occupies your evening, if you're willing." Victor Lennox stood between them for a moment. Then he raised his glass in a salute that was actually quite graceful under the circumstances, said, "Well played, Your Grace," and walked away. Charlotte looked at Malric. "That was high-handed," she said. "Yes. He didn't apologize for it. I could have handled him." "I know. Then why?" "Because," he said, and stopped, and something moved across his face that she recognized as a man navigating around something too large to be summarized quickly. "Because I spent the last 3 days watching you handle everything with a grace that most people in this room couldn't manufacture, and you do without thinking about it. And I didn't want to spend the one remaining evening of this summit watching someone else try to take up your time." He held her gaze. "I wanted to take it myself, if you'll let me." The ballroom hummed around them. The chandeliers threw light across everything. Charlotte looked at this man, this powerful, complicated, unexpectedly honest man, and thought about professionalism and careers and the particular loneliness of being extraordinary at your job and invisible everywhere else. "I'm on call until 9, she said. "I'll wait until 9. There's nothing formal. I'd only want somewhere quiet. I know somewhere quiet." She considered him for one more moment. Then she said, "All right." Somewhere quiet turned out to be a small sitting room in the East Wing that was not part of any official summit space, accessible through a door that Malric opened with a key and furnished with 2 chairs, a side table, a fireplace, and a view through the tall window of the palace garden under winter dark. They sat across from each other with 2 cups of tea that his chief of staff had conjured with the efficiency of someone who'd stopped being surprised by his employer's requests. Mr. Harlan closed the door. For a moment neither of them spoke. "Your father knows about the Schönberg connection," Charlotte said. "Yes." He didn't express surprise that she'd led with it. "He's known for years. It's in the family records. The old families cross-reference bloodlines. It's what they do. And he tried to intimidate me today." Malric's expression hardened. "I heard. I was coming from the south corridor. I heard the last part." He set down his teacup. "He won't do it again." "What did you say to him?" "What needed to be said." "That's not an answer." "I know." He looked at her directly. "I told him that Miss Darius is the most valuable interpreter this summit has had in 15 years, that her removal or harassment would be raised with the summit committee and the alliance board, and that her personal history and bloodline are none of his concern. Then I told him some additional things that were less professionally framed. Something warm moved through Charlotte's chest that she told herself to be careful about. "The bloodline," she said. "The Schönberg title, you said it was dissolved. In formal terms, the house dissolved. The blood doesn't." He leaned forward slightly. "There's a process. It's not simple, and it would require documentation, but if you wanted to establish the lineage officially, it could be done. Some of the Bavarian inheritance laws recognize maternal descent under specific conditions." "I'm not interested in a title," she said immediately. "I know." Something in his voice was very certain about this, and the certainty felt like recognition. "That's not why I'm telling you." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because your mother left you something, whether she meant to or not, whether she could explain it or not, and you deserve to know what it is. Not to claim it, just to know." Charlotte looked at the fire for a moment. "She used to read Rilke," she said, "late at night, after she thought I was asleep. I'd lie in bed and listen to her voice through the wall." She paused. "I thought it was just a language she loved, something beautiful she'd learned." "It was both things," Malric said quietly. "They're not mutually exclusive." She looked at him. "Why are you being kind to me?" He looked slightly taken aback by the directness of the question, and then something settled in his expression. "Because you walked into a palace reception in a borrowed gown and replied to my father's contempt with more dignity than anyone I've seen in a room full of people who've spent their entire lives learning to perform dignity." He held her gaze. "And because from the first moment I saw you, I couldn't look away. And I've spent 3 days trying to be professional about that, and I'm running out of summit to be professional in." The fire crackled. Outside, the winter garden was still and dark and very beautiful. "I go back to Brussels on Saturday," she said. "I know. My life it's small compared to yours. My apartment has a broken radiator. I remember. I'm not..." She paused, choosing words. I'm not someone who fits into your world, Malric, whatever my blood says, whatever my mother was. The world you live in has very clear ideas about, my world has very clear ideas about a great many things, he said, and I've been disagreeing with most of them for years. He picked up his teacup with a steadiness that looked deliberate. I'm not asking you to fit into my world. I'm asking if you'd be willing to let me know you. Better, longer, away from summit schedules and translation stations. She was quiet for a long time. The fire burned down slightly. There's a bookshop near my apartment, she said finally. In Brussels. It's open on Sunday mornings and it has the best collection of German romantic poetry outside of Munich. Malric looked at her. I'm there most Sundays, she added. If someone wanted to know where to find me, on a Sunday morning. She watched something move through his face that she hadn't seen there before. Something that looked, unexpectedly, like relief. I'll be in Brussels on Sunday, he said. That's a long way from your schedule. My schedule is mine to manage. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, all right. She went back to her room that night and lay on the bed looking at the ceiling and thought about her mother's hands folded in the portrait and the German that had always sounded like something ancient and specific, and she thought about what it meant to know the shape of where you came from without having been told the story. She thought about a man who had waited in a portrait gallery and told her the truth and said, I'll wait until 9, and meant it. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and made herself breathe slowly. This was not her world. She had said so herself. She believed it, thoroughly, practically, with full awareness of the distance between a 4th-floor walk-up in Brussels and a duke's ancestral estate. But she also believed what she'd said to Aldrich Kane in the corridor, with a surety that ran deeper than anything she could justify rationally. I will not bury what belongs to me. She boarded her train on Saturday morning. She did not expect him on Sunday. She was in the bookshop at 10:30, her coat buttoned against the cold, a cup of coffee from the cafe next door warming her hands, working her way through the German romantic poetry section with the patient pleasure of someone in absolutely no hurry. The bell above the bookshop door rang at 11. She didn't look up immediately. Then she smelled sandalwood and cold air, and she looked up. Malric Kane stood in the doorway of a small Brussels bookshop, in a coat that cost more than her rent, looking at her with the expression of a man who had managed something difficult, and was not entirely certain whether he ought to be proud of it, or terrified. She looked at him. You're here, she said. I said I would be. You live in a palace. I also live in London, he said mildly. Brussels is between them. That is a very generous interpretation of geography. I have a car. He moved into the shop, stepping around a display of French novels with the slightly careful movement of a very large, very well-dressed man in a very small space. You're reading Novalis. She looked down at the book in her hand. He wrote about the night as the place where everything true lives. I know. He stopped in front of her. Do you believe that? She considered him. The bookshop was warm and smelled of paper, and he'd come from wherever he'd come from because she'd said most Sundays, and apparently that had been sufficient information for a duke to reroute his Sunday morning. I think true things can live anywhere, she said, if you take care of them. Malric reached past her and took a second copy of Novalis from the shelf. He read the spine. Then he looked at her. Will you have coffee with me, he said, and tell me what else you think? She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about borrowed gowns and broken radiators, and a portrait in a moonlit gallery, and a woman who read Rilke through the wall to a child who was listening. She thought about what it meant to be seen. Yes, she said, and this time when she said it, she meant it without the professional distance, without the careful armor, without the practiced composure of a woman who had learned to be excellent at things specifically so that she couldn't be dismissed. She just meant it. She stepped out of the bookshop into the Brussels morning, and he fell into step beside her, and neither of them said anything for half a block, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't need to be filled, because what was in it was already enough. 3 weeks later, the story broke. She didn't see it coming. She should have. She was intelligent enough. She knew how Aldrich Kane operated. She'd felt the calculation in his eyes in that corridor. But she'd been in Brussels living her quiet life, and seeing Malric 3 times in those 3 weeks. Twice in Brussels, once in London, where he'd met her at the National Gallery, because she'd mentioned once that she was going to be there, and he'd said, I'll be there too, with the same matter-of-fact simplicity with which he did everything, and she'd allowed herself to believe, against her better judgment, that she was safe. The article appeared on a Tuesday morning in a tabloid that specialized in royal gossip. The headline used her name, which meant someone had fed it to them. The details were selective and pointed. An interpreter of uncertain background, no family name of note, romantically linked to the Duke of Kane following the Vienna summit. The suggestion was made, elegantly and without legal liability, that she'd leveraged her position during the summit to cultivate the attachment. That her unexpected confidence in the reception hall on the first night, replying to the Grand Duke in German, had been a calculated performance. That her apparent discovery of a connection to the Schönberg bloodline was conveniently timed. The article called her ambitious. It called her a social climber. It suggested that the Duke was being manipulated by a woman with nothing to lose and everything to gain. Charlotte read it once, in her apartment, over her morning coffee, with the winter light coming through the window at its usual 40 minutes. Then she put her coffee down very carefully and sat with it for a while. She thought about what to do. She thought about calling Malric. He would have seen it already. His people monitored everything. She thought about issuing a statement through the summit organization, clarifying her professional role. She thought about the many calm, rational, professional responses available to her. Then she thought about her mother, who had left a country and a lineage and a title and everything that came with it to live quietly in England with an English professor and read Rilke through the wall to her daughter at night. And she thought, what did she run from and why? And the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since the portrait gallery moved to the front. She picked up her phone and called Malric. He answered on the second ring. I've seen it. I know. Charlotte, was it your father? Brief, but present. We're investigating, he said. The sources are being... Was it your father, Malric? Another pause. Longer. Yes, he said. She breathed slowly. All right. Charlotte, I need you to tell me something first. She looked out the window at the Brussels street, gray and ordinary and entirely real. The Schönberg scandal, the thing that caused your family to be connected to the archive records, the marriage that was considered unsuitable, the one that made Margareth's granddaughter disappear. She kept her voice steady. Your family wasn't just adjacent to that story, were they? Silence. Tell me, she said, and he did. The Kane family had not simply known about the Schönberg dissolution. They had been instrumental in it. A century ago, when the Schönberg title had been at its most vulnerable, the Count dead, the Countess widowed, the house holding land that several powerful families had designs on. The Kane patriarch of the time had been one of the men who pressured the Bavarian Council to formalize the dissolution rather than allow the title to pass through the female line. He'd had reasons that were documented and others that were not. The land had been redistributed. Some of it had ended up in the hands of families with Kane connections. Margareth's granddaughter, Charlotte's mother, had fled not simply because of a unsuitable marriage. She'd fled because the families that had orchestrated her family's disenfranchisement had a long memory, and a young woman with a legitimate blood claim to dissolved assets was a liability to the people who'd benefited from that dissolution. Aldrich Kane knew this, had known it since before Charlotte was born, had known it the moment her name appeared on the summit interpreter list, had seen her walk into the reception hall and recognized the threat she represented, not just the embarrassment of Malric's attention, but the deeper, more dangerous possibility that someone would dig into the old records and find the Kane connection to the Schönberg dissolution. His mockery in German on the first evening had not been casual contempt. It had been a test, to see if she knew. She hadn't known then. She knew now. He was trying to make me leave, she said, before I found anything. Yes, Malric's voice was very controlled. He's been protecting the family's role in what happened for 30 years. He was protecting it when he saw your name. He was protecting it when he spoke to you at the reception. And he's protecting it now with this article. A beat. He wanted you afraid and discredited before you could piece it together. Does the land question still have legal implications? After 100 years? In theory, yes. In practice, he paused. The relevant Bavarian laws have changed significantly. A formal claim would be, it would be complex, difficult. Another pause. It might not succeed, but it might. It might. Charlotte sat with that. Malric, she said, your family benefited from what happened to mine. Yes. And your father has been trying to suppress my understanding of that since the moment I walked into that palace. Yes. And you knew some of this. She kept her voice careful, precise. Not all of it, but some of it. The pause was the longest yet. I knew the family connection to the Schönberg dissolution, he said. I didn't know the full extent of my father's actions regarding you specifically until I started asking questions 2 days ago. He breathed out. I should have told you what I knew as soon as I recognized your accent. I should have told you in the gallery. Why didn't you? Because I was afraid that if I told you, you would look at me and see the legacy instead of the man. His voice dropped. And I wanted you to see the man first. The Brussels street was gray and quiet outside. Her coffee had gone cold. She thought about what it meant to be honest too late, and whether the honesty mattered anyway, and whether this was the moment she should pull back and protect herself the way she'd protected herself for most of her adult life, through excellence and distance and professional composure. She thought about her mother reading Rilke. She thought about what she'd told Aldrich in that corridor. I will not bury what belongs to me. I need a few days, she said. Charlotte, not to disappear, just to think. She paused. Can you give me that? Yes, he said immediately. Whatever you need. And Malric, yes, the article. I want to respond to it, my way, not through a statement from your office or a spokesperson or the summit committee. She looked at the window. My way, a beat. Tell me what you need, he said. She thought for 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, she sat down at her desk and wrote a letter. Not to a newspaper, not to a committee, not to the Kane family solicitors. She wrote it to the editor of the Historical Records Division of the Bavarian State Archives. She wrote it in German, in the formal register of old houses, and she asked, with full and documented genealogical specificity, for access to the Schönberg dissolution records of 1883. She sent it by registered post. Then she called Malric. I'm not going to disappear, she said when he answered. I want you to know that. I'm not my mother. I'm not running from this. I know. His voice was quiet and very certain. But I need to understand it fully before we can. She paused. There are things that need to be settled. About your family's history and mine. And about the article. The article can be handled. Not by you. By me. She was clear about this. I know you want to fix it. I know you have the power to fix it. I need to fix it myself. Silence. This is the part where I would normally say something about resources and assistance, he said. I know. And you're telling me not to. I'm telling you I'll tell you when I need help. She paused. Which is different from telling you to do nothing. It just means, wait for me to ask. I can do that, he said. It will require significant effort. I believe in you, she said. And she meant it as both humor and truth. And she heard in the quality of his silence that he'd received it as both. The response took shape over the following week. Not legal. Not yet. The archive request was pending and legal proceedings around century-old dissolution records were the work of years, not days. But Charlotte had spent her career learning that language was the most precise instrument available to a human being, and she knew how to use it. She wrote an article. She wrote it under her own name, in English, and submitted it to a journal of diplomatic affairs that was read by exactly the people who needed to read it. Not the tabloid audience, but the world of international relations and royal protocol that was actually relevant to her career and her life. She wrote about the summit, about professional ethics in diplomatic translation, about the calculated use of social contempt as a tool of power, and about what it meant to be a woman of particular backgrounds in spaces that had not historically been designed for her. She did not name Aldrich Kane. She didn't need to. The people who mattered knew. The article was published on a Thursday. By Friday, 3 embassies had reached out to the summit organization to commend her work. Madame Fontaine sent a personal note. 2 universities requested her for speaking engagements. The original tabloid piece was quietly retracted, not with an apology, which she hadn't expected, but with a correction notice that was almost more satisfying because it was legally compelled rather than voluntarily offered. She was sitting in her apartment reading the retraction notice online when her phone rang. I read the article, Malric said. And? It was precise and devastating and entirely correct. And you didn't ask me for anything. I didn't need anything. No, he said. You didn't. She could hear in his voice the thing that was happening underneath the words, the thing that had been building since a reception hall in Vienna and a gallery at midnight and a bookshop on a Sunday morning. I want to see you, he said. I know. Charlotte, I'll be in London next week, she said. I have a meeting at the Royal Institute on Wednesday. I'll be in London on Wednesday. Of course you will. Is that acceptable? She looked at the retraction notice on her screen. She looked at her apartment, the cold radiator, The 40 minutes of afternoon sun, the books stacked 3 deep on every available surface, the desk where she'd written the article and the letter to the Bavarian archives. She thought about what she'd built here, from the things her mother had given her, the language, the instinct, the precise and stubborn knowledge of her own worth. She thought about what it might look like to build something larger without giving any of that away. Yes, she said, Wednesday is acceptable. Wednesday arrived in London grey and cold and very clear-aired, the way November sometimes was in that city, the sky high and washed of cloud, everything sharper than usual. They met at the Institute first. She had her meeting. He waited in the cafe across the street without being asked to, because he was learning the grammar of this thing between them, which was, she asks, you provide, she doesn't ask, you wait. He was exceptionally good at learning. After, they walked. It was not a formal walk. No destination, no plan. Through Bloomsbury and up toward the edge of Regent's Park, their breath visible in the cold air, talking about everything that had accumulated in the weeks since Brussels. The article, the archives, the Schönberg records, which the archival division had confirmed holding and would process her access request within 60 days. The article she was considering writing about her mother, not a legal document, not a claim, just a story. A true one. Your father, she said at one point. Malric was quiet for a step or two. I've spoken with the family solicitors, separately from him, about the dissolution records and about the families that benefited. He kept his eyes on the path ahead. If there's anything retrievable, any portion of the original assets that can be addressed, even symbolically, I want to address it. That's not your responsibility. The House of Kane benefited from what happened to the House of Schönberg. I inherited that benefit. That makes it my responsibility, whatever the law says. He glanced at her. Whether or not you pursue any formal action, whether or not this, a slight pause, whether or not this goes anywhere, it would still be the right thing to do. She looked at him. The park was bare and beautiful beside them, the last of the leaves down, the branches very clear against the high cold sky. You're a better man than your father, she said. That's a low bar. It's also true. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him, and they stood in the November Park, and she looked at him, and he looked at her and the thing between them that had been building since Vienna was fully present now, not hidden behind professional courtesy or careful timing, or the specific loneliness of two people who were both, in different ways, better at being seen from a distance than up close. I'm in love with you, he said. It came out simply, without the careful architecture she might have expected from a man who managed everything with precision. Just the words, direct and present and somewhat breathless, as though they'd been pressing against something for weeks, and the walk through Bloomsbury had finally given them an opening. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a very large statement, she said. I know. We've known each other 6 weeks. I know. Your father hates me. I know that too. My apartment still has a broken radiator. Charlotte. He said her name the way he'd said it the first time, like a key in a lock, like something precise and irreversible. I've been trying to say that correctly for 3 weeks, and I have apparently run out of diplomacy. He held her gaze. I love you. That's what it is. I'm not asking you to do anything about it immediately. I'm not asking you to say it back. I'm asking you to know it so that everything I do from here makes sense to you. She breathed in the cold air. She thought about what her mother had left her, the language, the instinct, the jaw of a woman who'd chosen something real over something safe. She thought about what she'd built, the precision, the composure, the specific and ferocious commitment to being so excellent that no one could justify turning her away. She thought about how strange it was, how completely, unexpectedly strange, to be standing in a London park in November with a duke who'd come to a Brussels bookshop because she'd mentioned she was there most Sundays, and to feel, for possibly the first time in her adult life, like the full version of herself. I know, she said softly. He waited. I'm not there yet, she added. I'm working my way toward it. I need you to know that. I'm not running from it, I'm just working your way toward it, he said. I understand. Do you? Yes. His voice was very certain and very warm. Take all the time you need. She looked at him for another moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. Just her fingers finding his in the cold air of the November park, the way you might do something you'd been meaning to do for weeks and had simply been waiting for the right moment to be ordinary about. His hand closed around hers, warm, steady. They stood like that for a moment, and then they started walking again, and the park was bare and clear and very beautiful, and neither of them said anything for a while because what was in the silence was already enough. January brought the archive response. The Bavarian State Archives confirmed access to the Schönberg dissolution records and offered additionally, quietly, that certain procedural irregularities in the original 1083 dissolution process had been noted in historical reviews, and that if a formal petition were made by a documented descendant, it would be received. The word irregularities was doing considerable work in that sentence, and Charlotte read it 3 times to make sure she understood what she was being told. She forwarded the letter to the legal team she'd engaged, not Kane family solicitors, her own, paid with money she'd saved, and the advance from the diplomatic journal that had run 2 more of her pieces since the first, and they confirmed that the process was viable. Not simple, not fast, but viable, she called her father. He was in his 70s now, still sharp, still the English professor who'd married an enigmatic woman who read Rilke and never quite explained herself. She hadn't told him yet what she'd found at the palace. She told him now. There was a long silence on the line. She knew, he said finally. I think so. I think she knew the whole time. He started and then stopped. She said once that she'd left behind things that didn't belong to her anymore. I thought she meant relationships, friendships, people she'd fallen away from. I didn't think she meant a name. I think she left it behind on purpose, Charlotte said carefully. I think she made a choice about what she wanted her life to be, and she built it, and she gave me everything she could from what she'd been, without the parts that had hurt her. The German, her father said softly. The German, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Are you going to pursue the petition? I don't know yet. Maybe. Not for the title. I don't want the title, but the record. The acknowledgement that the dissolution was irregular, that she existed and was removed. Charlotte paused. I think she deserves to be in the record correctly. Yes, said her father. She does. March arrived. The petition was filed. It would take time, months, probably over a year. But it was filed and documented and real. The Kane family solicitors reached out, separately and on Malrich's instruction, to discuss the land question. The conversation was early and careful, and would also take time. But it had begun. Aldrich Kane had not spoken publicly about any of it. He'd retreated to the ancestral estate in Scotland, and was not, as far as Charlotte could determine, planning to emerge until he'd figured out how to reframe a situation that had moved entirely out of his control. She felt nothing particularly dramatic about this. She'd spent her life being underestimated by men who thought small gestures of contempt were sufficient to make things disappear. She'd learned that the best response was to remain, and work, and be excellent, until the smallness of the gesture became obvious. She was in London now, more than Brussels. The work had expanded. 2 summit contracts, a university consultation. The diplomatic journal had offered her a column. Her apartment in Brussels still had the broken radiator, but she'd finally called the landlord. She'd also started looking at apartments in London, which she'd told Malrich about as a fact, and not an invitation. And he'd received it as a fact, and simply said there's a good area near Bloomsbury as a neutral observation, which was how they operated, and it worked. They were in his London study on a Tuesday evening in March when his phone rang and he answered and spoke briefly, and then ended the call with an expression she'd learned to read, as there is a thing happening that I'm deciding how to tell you. What is it? My father is in London. He set the phone down. He's requested a meeting. With you? With both of us. She was very still for a moment. He wants to meet with me. He has apparently, Malrich said carefully, decided to renegotiate his position. What does that mean? I believe it means he's been told by his own legal team that the petition and the land discussion are proceeding regardless of his cooperation or lack thereof, and that continued opposition will be more damaging to the family's public position than, he paused, than accepting the situation. The situation being me. The situation being us, he said. Yes, she looked at him. He looked back, and his expression held something she'd come to understand, the steady, unwavering quality of a man who'd made up his mind about something fully and didn't experience uncertainty about it after the decision was made. You're not going to tell me I don't have to agree to the meeting, she said. No, he said. I'm going to tell you that it's entirely your choice, and that whatever you decide I'll support completely, including never being in the same room as him again. But, a slight pause, but I believe he's scared. Genuinely. Not of losing control over me. He lost that when I walked past him in a corridor to find an interpreter who'd slipped away through a gallery. Something moved on his face. He's scared of losing the narrative, of being the man in the record who tried to erase someone and failed, and I think he stopped. I think a frightened Aldrich Kane who's agreed to come to a meeting might be more useful than a defiant one. Charlotte considered this. What do you want from the meeting? He held her gaze. An apology to you, a formal one, and a public withdrawal of any support for narratives suggesting your motivations were anything other than professional. And the land matter? That proceeds separately, through legal channels. This isn't contingent on it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, set the meeting. The meeting was held at the Kane London residence, which was a different building from Beaumont Palace, but made of the same particular substance, height and grandeur, and the specific weight of centuries. Charlotte wore her own clothes. A dark green dress she'd bought in London the previous month. Good boots. The pearl earrings her father had given her the Christmas after her mother died. She wore nothing borrowed. She needed nothing borrowed. Aldrich Kane was seated when they arrived. He rose when she entered, which was a small thing, and also not a small thing. She sat across from him. He looked older than he had in Vienna. Not diminished. That wasn't the word, but aware, in a way he hadn't been in February, that the world had continued to exist past the edges of his management of it. Miss Darius, he said. Your Grace, she replied. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at her, and to his credit, she would give him this. He looked directly. The remarks I made in Vienna, he said, were calculated, not impulsive. I recognized your name and I understood what your presence might mean, and I chose contempt as a method of intimidation. He paused. That was wrong. It was also ineffective, which perhaps you're aware of, but the wrongness existed separately from the effectiveness. She waited. The article that appeared in January, he continued. I was the source. I believe that discrediting you publicly was preferable to allowing the legal and historical questions to proceed unchallenged. He stopped. I was wrong about that also, and I am... A slight hesitation, the word cost him something. I am sorry. The room was very quiet. Why now? She asked. He looked at her. Because my son told me, in terms that were quite clear, that the choice was this or losing him entirely. And because... He paused again, and she saw something unexpected cross his face. Because I looked at what my family did 100 years ago to yours, and I looked at what I did in Vienna and in January, and I recognized a pattern I didn't like. He picked up his teacup and set it down without drinking from it. I have spent my life protecting the Kane legacy. I've been protecting the wrong parts. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. She didn't forgive him. She wasn't sure she ever would, entirely. That wasn't what this meeting was. But she recognized what was happening in this room, and it was real. Uncomfortable and insufficient, and still real. I'll need the public statement to be specific, she said. Not vague. My professional qualifications, my conduct at the summit, the circumstances of the tabloid article. Agreed. The land discussion continues through legal channels on its own timeline. Agreed. And, she paused, I'd like you to know that whatever the petition finds, whatever the record says at the end of this, I'm not pursuing it to take something from you. I'm pursuing it because my mother deserves to be in the record correctly. She held his gaze. That's all. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, She was like you. Your mother. I saw photographs when the archive questions first arose. The same look of someone who understood precisely what was being said about them and had decided to answer with her life rather than her words. It hit her somewhere she hadn't fully armored. She breathed through it. Yes, she said simply. She was. The statement was issued on a Thursday in April and was, as she'd required, specific. Malric had reviewed it and added nothing because she'd told him it was hers to review, and he'd nodded and put his pen down. The response was quiet, some surprise, some relief from people who'd been paying attention. The tabloid, which had already issued its correction, published nothing further. Charlotte published a short piece in the diplomatic journal about the summit, about the Bavarian archive process, about what it meant to establish a record for someone who'd chosen not to establish one themselves. She didn't name her mother, but the portrait of Countess Margarethe was reproduced with permission from the Beaumont Palace archive, and anyone reading the piece with attention would understand. She thought that was enough. She thought her mother, who had built a life from what she'd escaped, and loved it genuinely, and raised a daughter who could reply to a Grand Duke's contempt in the language of old houses. She thought her mother would have thought it was enough too. It was a Sunday in May when she said it. They were in the Brussels bookshop. She'd kept her apartment through everything. She liked it. She liked the 40 minutes of sun and the broken radiator that was now fixed, and the place that was entirely hers. And he'd come on a Sunday morning because he still came on Sunday mornings, because that had been the beginning, and they kept it. She was reading Novalis. He was reading something dense about European economic policy that she suspected he found genuinely interesting and did not mock him for. The bookshop was warm. The owner knew their names now. She looked up at him. He was reading, his brow slightly furrowed in the way it got when he was working something out. Not frustrated, just engaged. His whole attention on the thing in front of him. He had his coffee on the small table beside him and his coat over the arm of the chair, and she looked at him, and the word that came was not any of the formal words. Not Duke or Your Grace or powerful were feared. The word that came was home. Malric, she said. He looked up. I love you, she said. Very simply. The way you said true things when you'd been working your way toward them long enough that there was nothing left to hide behind. His expression did the thing it did, the opening she'd first seen in a moonlit gallery in Vienna, the particular unguarding of a man who'd been very well defended for a very long time. I know, he said. She laughed. You've been waiting to say that. For 3 months, he agreed. I learned it from you. She shook her head. You're impossible. I'm yours, he said, which is the relevant fact. She looked at him. This man who'd come to a Brussels bookshop in November, because she'd said most Sundays, who'd waited at 9 o'clock in 6 weeks and 3 months, who'd told her the truth in a gallery and sat in an uncomfortable chair to give her time and loved her in the particular, steady, undemonstrative way that turned out, she had discovered, to be the exact way she needed to be loved. Yes, she said, you are. He smiled. The real one, the one that made him look younger and warm and nothing like the reputation. And went back to his economic policy, and she went back to Novalis, and the bookshop held them in its particular Sunday morning peace. They were married in the autumn. Not a grand ceremony. Malric had offered one, and she'd declined, and he'd accepted this with the same equanimity with which he accepted everything she was. 40 people, a small chapel on the Beaumont estate with the relevant papers and the relevant vows. Her father walked her down the aisle and wept, which she'd expected. Malric's expression when she came through the door was not controlled at all, which she had not entirely expected, and which she carried with her, warm and certain, for the rest of her life. The Bavarian Archive petition was resolved the following spring. The dissolution of 1883 was found to have been procedurally irregular, the record amended to reflect Margareth Darius Schönberg's lineage as legitimate and continuous. No title was restored. The title had been formally dissolved, and that was not something the modern process reversed, but the record existed. The history was correctly stated. Charlotte Darius, now Charlotte Kane, was documented as the direct descendant of the House of Schönberg, the bloodline real and acknowledged. She published a piece about it in the journal. She included the portrait. She included her mother's name. She dedicated it as follows. For Anna Darius, who taught me German before she taught me anything else, and who built her life from the truest things she had. Malric read it when it was published, sitting across from her in the study of the London house that was now theirs. He read it all the way through without speaking. When he finished, he set the journal down and looked at her with the expression she loved most on his face, the one that was simply present, simply there. She would be proud, he said. I think she'd have liked you, Charlotte said. Eventually. Eventually? She was discerning. He smiled. So is her daughter. Charlotte reached across the desk and took his hand, the way she'd first done it in a November park, ordinary and certain. Outside, London moved in its usual way, urgent and old and indifferent to individual stories, the way cities were. But inside this room, in the light of an afternoon that held more than 40 minutes of sun, the story was entirely and completely theirs. Poor is a relative term. Insignificant is a matter of perspective. And love built on truth and time and the precise, unburied knowledge of where you came from, turned out to be the most permanent thing in any palace. To every heart that stayed, until the very last word, thank you. Charlotte's story belongs to anyone who has ever been told they are too small for the room they're standing in, and answered with everything they were. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. We are the Royal Duke Diaries. and we tell the stories that refuse to stay buried. Subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and meet us here again, because the next story is already waiting.